The gunshot echoed through the canyon, and Samuel Jenkins knew immediately it was not meant for the deer he had been tracking but for him. And as he dove behind a boulder with his heart hammering against his ribs, he understood that someone wanted him dead before sunset. Dust kicked up around the rock as another bullet slammed into the earth beside him. Samuel pressed his back against the sun-warmed stone, breathing hard, his rifle clutched tight in both hands. The Wyoming Territory stretched out below him in shades of gold and rust. The town of Silverton, a cluster of buildings in the valley that looked no bigger than a child's toy blocks from this height. It was 1878, and death came easy in these mountains. "Jenkins," a voice called from somewhere above. "You got something that belongs to Mr. Cartwright, and he wants it back." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. Of course it was about the land deed. Everything in this God-forsaken territory came down to land or gold, and sometimes both. The deed in his saddlebag proved that the water rights Cartwright had been claiming for the past 2 years actually belonged to a widow woman named Pauline Foster. And Samuel had made the mistake of agreeing to deliver it to the territorial judge in Cheyenne. He had thought himself prepared for trouble, but not an ambush 3 miles outside of town. "The deed goes to the judge," Samuel shouted back. "You can tell Cartwright that stealing water from a widow woman does not make him a big man, just makes him a thief." The response was another gunshot, this one closer. Samuel counted the seconds between shots, trying to determine how many men Cartwright had sent. At least 2, maybe 3. His horse had bolted at the first shot, which meant he was on foot with limited ammunition, and no clear path down the mountain except straight through whoever wanted him dead. Love had taught Samuel Jenkins that caring about anything led only to pain. His mother had loved his father, and it had earned her a decade of bruises and broken promises before the whiskey finally stopped his heart. Samuel had loved a girl once, back in Missouri when he was 19, loved her with the kind of desperate intensity that young men mistake for forever. She had married his brother instead, and the betrayal had burned so deep that Samuel had packed his few belongings and ridden west without looking back. That was 8 years ago, and in all that time, he had kept his heart locked up tight, convinced that suffering was the price of caring, and that the only way to avoid the pain was to never let anyone close enough to matter. But he had made a promise to deliver that deed, and Samuel Jenkins kept his promises even when it might cost him his life. He waited for the next shot, and when it came he rolled from behind the boulder and fired twice in quick succession toward the muzzle flash he had glimpsed among the rocks above. A man's cry told him at least one bullet had found its mark. Samuel did not wait to see if the man would rise again. He ran, scrambling down the rocky slope toward a stand of pine trees that offered better cover than the exposed mountainside. Bullets chased him, kicking up dirt at his heels, but he made it to the trees and pressed himself against a thick trunk, gasping for breath. His side ached where an old wound had never quite healed right, a souvenir from a cattle drive 2 years back when a spooked longhorn had caught him with its horns. Everything hurt these days, it seemed. That was what 27 years of hard living did to a man. "He is heading for the pines," someone yelled. "Cut him off before he reaches the creek." Samuel moved deeper into the trees, his boots silent on the carpet of fallen needles. The creek was a good idea, actually. If he could reach it, he could follow it down to the valley floor and maybe lose his pursuers in the process. The water would cover his tracks, and by the time they figured out which way he had gone, he could be halfway to the next town. He ran in a crouch, using the trees for cover, his breath coming in short gasps. His lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, but fear and stubbornness kept him moving. Behind him he could hear men crashing through the undergrowth, at least 2 of them, maybe more. They were spreading out, trying to flank him. The ground dropped away suddenly, and Samuel half slid, half fell down a steep embankment, rocks and dirt cascading around him. He landed hard at the bottom, jarring his teeth, but he was up again in an instant, stumbling toward the sound of running water. The creek was narrow here, no more than 10 feet across, the water rushing cold and clear over smooth stones. Samuel splashed into it without hesitation, gasping at the shock of the cold, and began wading downstream as fast as the current and the slippery rocks would allow. He had gone maybe 100 yards when he heard the voices behind him, arguing about which direction he had gone. Samuel did not slow down. He kept moving, his legs numb from the cold water, his wet boots making every step an effort. The creek wound through a narrow canyon, high walls rising on either side, and Samuel followed it blindly, trusting that it would eventually lead him to safety. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when he finally pulled himself out of the water, his teeth chattering, his clothes soaked through. He could no longer hear his pursuers, which meant either he had lost them or they were being very quiet. Samuel decided not to wait around to find out which. He found a game trail leading away from the creek and followed it east, toward the setting sun, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the men who wanted him dead. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and with it came a cold that cut through Samuel's wet clothing like a knife. He knew he needed to find shelter and get warm or risk dying of exposure, but he did not dare start a fire that might give away his position. Instead, he kept walking, his body shaking with cold, his mind drifting in and out of focus. He thought about the widow Pauline Foster, who he had never met but whose land deed he carried. He wondered if she knew men were willing to kill for her water rights, or if she was just trying to survive like everyone else in this hard country. He thought about his brother and the girl he had loved, wondered if they were still together in Missouri, if they ever thought about him. Probably not. People moved on, built their lives, and forgot about the ones who left. That was the way of things. Samuel stumbled over a root and went down hard, his hands scraping against rocky ground. He lay there for a moment, too tired and cold to get up, wondering if it would be easier to just stay down and let the cold take him. It would be a peaceful death, they said. You just went to sleep and did not wake up. But that was quitting, and Samuel Jenkins had never quit anything in his life. He pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet, and kept walking. He did not know how much time had passed when he saw the light. It was just a faint glow at first, barely visible through the trees, but it was enough to give him direction. Samuel stumbled toward it, hardly daring to hope it might be a cabin or a shepherd's camp, somewhere with warmth and shelter. As he got closer, he could make out the shape of a small homestead. A cabin with a sod roof, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a corral with a single horse. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the windows glowed with lamplight. It looked like heaven. Samuel made it to the front door and knocked, his knuckles barely making a sound against the wood. He tried again, harder this time, and heard movement inside. The door opened, and Samuel found himself looking at a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, brown eyes that widened at the sight of him, and a rifle pointed directly at his chest. "Please," Samuel managed through chattering teeth. "I mean no harm, I just need to get warm." The woman studied him for a long moment, her expression wary. Samuel could see the calculation in her eyes, weighing the risk of letting a stranger into her home against the basic decency of not letting a man freeze to death on her doorstep. "You are soaked through," she said finally. Her voice was soft but firm, with an accent that spoke of education and breeding that seemed out of place in this rough country. "Were you in the creek?" "Yes, madam, being chased. Men with guns. I have done nothing wrong, I swear it. I am just trying to deliver something to the territorial judge." Something shifted in the woman's expression. She lowered the rifle slightly, though she did not put it down entirely. "You are Samuel Jenkins." It was not a question. Samuel blinked in surprise. "How do you know my name?" "Because I am Pauline Foster, and that something you are trying to deliver belongs to me." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come inside before you freeze to death. I did not go through the trouble of hiring you just to have you die on my doorstep." Samuel stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, his legs barely supporting him. The heat hit him like a physical force and he swayed on his feet. Pauline caught his arm, surprisingly strong for someone who barely came up to his shoulder, and guided him to a chair by the fire. "Sit," she ordered. "I will get you something dry to wear and something hot to drink. Do not even think about arguing." Samuel was too cold and tired to argue. He sat, his wet clothes dripping onto the floor, and watched as Pauline disappeared into another room. The cabin was small but well kept, everything in its place. A table and 2 chairs sat near the window, a narrow bed against one wall, shelves lined with books and supplies. It was the home of someone who had made the best of difficult circumstances, someone who refused to be defeated by hardship. Pauline returned with a bundle of clothes, men's clothes that had been carefully folded and stored away. "These were my husband's," she said quietly. "He has been gone 3 years now, and I kept thinking I should get rid of them, but I never did. I suppose now I know why." "I am sorry for your loss, madam. So am I." She turned away, giving him privacy. "Change out of those wet things before you catch pneumonia. I will make coffee." Samuel peeled off his wet clothes with numb fingers, his body shaking so hard he could barely manage the buttons. The dry clothes were a little too big, but they were warm, and that was all that mattered. He pulled on the wool shirt and pants, then wrapped himself in the blanket Pauline had left on the chair. "Better?" she asked, turning back with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Much, thank you." Samuel accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping both hands around it to soak up the heat. "You should not have let me in. I brought trouble to your door." "The trouble was already at my door," Pauline said, settling into the chair across from him. "Cartwright has been trying to force me off this land for 2 years. When I found proof that the water rights were legally mine, he escalated. Burned my hay barn last month. Shot at my horse the week before that. He wants this land, and he does not care what he has to do to get it." "Why does he want it so badly?" "The creek that runs through my property is the only reliable water source for miles. Control the water, control the land. Cartwright wants to expand his cattle operation, and he needs my water to do it. When my husband was alive, Cartwright tried to buy us out. When Thomas died, he figured a widow woman would be easy to intimidate. But you are not easy to intimidate." A ghost of a smile touched Pauline's lips. "No, Mr. Jenkins, I am not. I grew up in Boston, the daughter of a lawyer who believed women should be educated and capable of taking care of themselves. When I married Thomas and came west, everyone said I would not last a year. That was 5 years ago. I have outlasted my husband, 2 droughts, and countless men who thought they could tell me what to do with my own property." Samuel found himself studying her more carefully. She was probably around his age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with the kind of practical beauty that came from competence and determination, rather than soft features and careful grooming. Her hands were calloused from work, her face sun-bronzed despite the bonnet he could see hanging by the door. This was not a woman who sat idle. "Why did you hire me?" he asked. "I am just a ranch hand, not a courier." "Because the men in town are either working for Cartwright, afraid of Cartwright, or unwilling to help a woman. You are new to Silverton, you have a reputation for being honest, and you needed the money. That made you either the perfect choice or a terrible one, and I decided to take the risk. It was almost a terrible one. Cartwright's men ambushed me up on the ridge. Did you lose the deed? No. Samuel pulled the wet saddlebag closer, relieved to find the oilskin pouch inside still intact. He pulled out the deed, checking to make sure the water had not damaged it. The document was damp but readable, the official seal still clear. It is safe. Relief flooded Pauline's face. Thank God. That deed is the only thing standing between me and losing everything. When do you need it in Cheyenne? The hearing is in 4 days. The judge will decide whether Cartwright's claim or mine is valid. If I can get this deed to him before then, the case is closed in my favor. If not, Cartwright wins by default. Samuel did some quick calculation. Cheyenne was 2 days' hard ride from here, which meant he would need to leave by tomorrow morning at the latest to make it in time. I will leave at first light, but I will need a horse. Mine is in the barn. You can take her. What will you do without a horse? Survive, Pauline said simply. I always do. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, reminding Samuel of how close he had come to dying of cold in the darkness. He owed this woman his life, even though she was the one who had put him in danger in the first place by hiring him to deliver the deed. Why did you stay? Samuel asked suddenly. After your husband died, why not go back to Boston? You must have family there. Pauline stared into her coffee cup. My father disowned me when I married Thomas. He said I was throwing my life away on a dreamer and a fool. Thomas was both those things, but he was also kind and he loved me, and he believed we could build something good out here. When he died in a riding accident, I thought about leaving. But then I realized that would mean my father was right, that I could not make it on my own. So I stayed out of stubbornness more than anything else. That is as good a reason as any. What about you, Mr. Jenkins? What brought you to Wyoming? Samuel hesitated. He did not talk about his past, did not like to dwell on the choices that had led him here. But there was something about sitting in this warm cabin, wearing a dead man's clothes, drinking coffee with a woman who had every reason to be bitter but seemed merely determined, that loosened his tongue. I ran away from Missouri 8 years ago. From family, from a girl I thought I loved, from everything. I have been moving west ever since, working cattle drives and ranch jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Why not? Because putting down roots means caring about something, and caring means getting hurt. My father hurt my mother every day for 20 years. The girl I loved chose my brother over me. I learned that love just means suffering, so I stopped loving anything. Pauline looked at him with those steady brown eyes. That sounds like a lonely way to live. Lonely is safe. Safe is not the same as happy. No, Samuel agreed, but happy is not guaranteed either. They were interrupted by the sound of horses outside. Pauline was on her feet instantly, grabbing her rifle. Samuel stood as well, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, which he realized was still with his wet clothes in a heap by the fire. He snatched it up, checking to make sure the water had not damaged the ammunition. "Get away from the windows," Pauline whispered. She moved to the door, peering through a crack in the shutters. 3 riders. I cannot see their faces in the dark. Cartwright's men, Samuel said grimly. They must have tracked me here, or they guessed where you would go. Pauline checked her rifle, her movements calm and practiced. This is not the first time they have come around trying to intimidate me. A voice called from outside. Mrs. Foster, we know you got Jenkins in there. Send him out and we will leave you be. Pauline looked at Samuel, one eyebrow raised in question. It was his choice, her expression said. He could go out and face them, probably die in the process, and leave her alone. Or he could stay and fight and risk getting her killed too. Samuel moved to the window on the other side of the door, positioning himself so he could see out without being an easy target. "How many bullets do you have?" 20 in the rifle, another 50 in the box under the bed. "They will not rush the cabin. Too risky. They will probably try to wait us out or smoke us out. Or burn us out," Paulin said. "They already burned my hay barn. They would not hesitate to burn the cabin with us in it." Samuel cursed under his breath. She was right. Fire was the easiest way to force them outside, and once they were in the open, it would be a quick fight. "We need to get out before they think of it. There is a root cellar with a tunnel that comes out near the barn. Thomas dug it in case of Indian attacks, though we never needed it. If we can reach the barn, we can get my horse and ride out. They will have someone watching the barn. Only if they know about the tunnel. Most people do not. It was a risk, but staying was a worse risk." Samuel nodded. "Show me." Paulin led him to a corner of the cabin where a worn rug covered the floor. She pulled it back, revealing a trapdoor. Samuel helped her lift it, peering down into darkness. A ladder descended into a small cellar carved from the earth, cool air wafting up from below. "Go," Samuel whispered. "I will cover you." Paulin did not argue. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and climbed down quickly. Samuel followed, pulling the trapdoor closed over their heads. The darkness was absolute for a moment until Paulin struck a match, lighting a small lantern that hung from a nail in the dirt wall. The cellar was tiny, barely 8 feet square, lined with shelves holding preserves and dried goods. At the far end, Samuel could see the opening of a tunnel, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. "It is about 30 feet to the barn," Paulin said quietly. "The exit is hidden behind some boards in the back stall. Can you make it?" Samuel's side ached at the thought of crawling 30 feet, but he had no choice. "Lead the way." Paulin extinguished the lantern and began crawling into the tunnel. Samuel followed, his larger frame barely fitting in the narrow space. The earth smelled damp and close, and he had to force himself not to think about the weight of soil above them or what would happen if the tunnel collapsed. He focused on the sound of Paulin moving ahead of him, the rustle of her skirts and the soft scrape of her hands against the dirt floor. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before Paulin stopped. Samuel heard her fumbling with something, then a crack of light appeared as she pushed aside the boards covering the exit. She crawled through, and Samuel followed, emerging in the dusty darkness of the barn. The horse, a sturdy buckskin mare, shifted nervously in her stall. Paulin went to her immediately, stroking her neck and whispering reassurances. Samuel moved to the barn door, peering out through a gap in the boards. He could see 2 of the riders in front of the cabin, their horses standing hipshot in the moonlight. The third man was nowhere to be seen, which made Samuel nervous. "We need to move fast," he whispered. "Once they realize we are gone, they will come looking." Paulin was already saddling the mare with quick, efficient movements. "We cannot both ride her for long. She is strong, but not that strong. We will go on foot until we are clear, then take turns riding." It was not a great plan, but it was the only one they had. Paulin led the mare from her stall, and Samuel eased the barn door open just enough for them to slip through. They moved in silence, keeping the barn between them and the riders, heading into the darkness toward the tree line 100 yards away. They had made it halfway when a shout went up behind them. "They are running! Stop them!" Samuel grabbed Paulin's hand and they ran, the mare trotting beside them. Gunshots cracked through the night, bullets whizzing past them, but the darkness and the distance made them poor targets. They reached the trees and kept running, branches whipping at their faces, roots trying to trip them. Behind them they could hear the riders mounting up, hear the thunder of hooves as they gave chase. "Mount up," Samuel said, boosting Paulin into the saddle. He ran beside the horse as she kicked it into a gallop, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. The mare was fast, pulling ahead despite his best efforts to keep up. Samuel risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the riders gaining ground, their horses fresher and faster. Paulin must have seen them too, because she wheeled the mare around and rode back toward Samuel. "Get on!" Samuel did not waste time arguing. He grabbed her outstretched hand and swung up behind her, his arms going around her waist as she kicked the mare forward again. The horse grunted under the extra weight but did not slow, her powerful legs eating up the ground. They rode through the forest in near darkness, trusting the horse to find her way. Behind them, the pursuit continued, but the trees and the night were in their favor. Gradually, the sound of hoofbeats faded, and Samuel allowed himself to hope they might actually escape. They rode for hours, stopping only when the mare began to stumble with exhaustion. Samuel dismounted first, then helped Paulin down. They were both breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. "We need to rest," Samuel said. "The horse is done in, and so are we." Paulin nodded, too tired to argue. They led the mare to a small clearing where a stream trickled over rocks, letting her drink and graze on the sparse grass. Samuel sank down against a tree, his body aching in a dozen different places. Paulin sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not leaving me behind. You saved my life first. Seemed only fair to return the favor. Most men would have gone out that door and taken their chances rather than risk a woman's safety. Most men are fools." Paulin laughed softly, a sound that seemed almost foreign in the darkness. "My father would agree with you on that point, even if he disagrees with me on everything else." They sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl. Samuel found himself acutely aware of Paulin's presence beside him, the warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was strange to feel so comfortable with someone he had just met, strange and a little frightening. "Where will you go?" Samuel asked. "After the hearing, I mean." "Even if you win, Cartwright is not going to give up. He will find other ways to force you off your land. I will deal with that when it comes, one problem at a time. That is not much of a plan. No, but it is all I have." Paulin turned to look at him, her face pale in the moonlight. "What about you? After you deliver the deed to the judge, what then? Another ranch job in another town?" "That was the plan." "Was?" Samuel hesitated. He did not know how to explain the feeling that had been growing in him since he stumbled onto Paulin Foster's doorstep, the sense that something had shifted in his carefully constructed world of isolation and self-protection. "I am starting to think maybe lonely is not as safe as I thought it was." "What changed your mind?" "You did." The words came out before Samuel could stop them, honest and raw. "Watching you stand there with a rifle, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to give up even though everything is stacked against you. You could have turned bitter after your husband died, could have gone home to Boston and admitted defeat. But you did not. You stayed and you fought, and you are still fighting. That takes a kind of strength I do not have. You have plenty of strength, Samuel Jenkins. You just do not know it yet." There was something in the way she said his name, soft and certain, that made Samuel's chest tighten. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a determined widow or a woman in need of help, but someone who understood pain and loneliness and the cost of survival. Someone who had chosen to keep hoping despite every reason not to. "I have spent 8 years running from anything that might hurt me," Samuel said. 8 years convinced that caring about anything was just asking for pain. And then I meet you, and suddenly I am wondering if maybe I have been wrong about everything. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that when I look at you, I do not see suffering. I see someone worth suffering for, and that terrifies me." Pauline reached out and took his hand, her fingers rough and warm. "It terrifies me too. I told myself after Thomas died that I would never let myself care for anyone again, that it was easier to be alone than to risk losing someone else. But here you are, and here I am, and I find myself wanting to take that risk." Samuel squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands in the darkness, not saying anything because words seemed inadequate for what was passing between them. It was not the wild, desperate love he had felt for the girl in Missouri, the kind that burned bright and fast and left nothing but ashes. This was something different, something quieter and deeper, built on honesty and shared hardship and the recognition of kindred spirits. "We should sleep," Pauline said eventually. "We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." They took turns keeping watch, sleeping in shifts while the moon tracked across the sky. When Samuel's turn to rest came, he found himself unable to sleep at first, his mind too full of thoughts and questions. But eventually exhaustion won out and he drifted off with Pauline's hand still in his. He woke to gray dawn light and the smell of smoke. Samuel sat up quickly, his hand going to his gun, but Pauline was already awake, tending a small fire and heating water in a battered tin pot. "Coffee," she offered, smiling at his expression. "I grabbed some supplies from the cellar before we left, figured we would need them." Samuel accepted the cup gratefully, impressed once again by her practical thinking. "How long until Cheyenne?" "If we ride steady and do not run into trouble, we can make it by tomorrow night. That gives us a day to spare before the hearing. And if we do run into trouble, then we deal with it." Pauline poured herself coffee and sat beside him. "I have learned that worrying about what might happen is a waste of energy. Better to save your strength for what does happen." They broke camp as soon as they finished their coffee, mounting the mare and heading east toward Cheyenne. The ride was long and uncomfortable, the mare struggling under the weight of two riders, but she kept going with the same stubborn determination as her owner. They stopped frequently to let her rest and graze, walking alongside her to give her a break from carrying them. As they traveled, Samuel and Pauline talked, sharing stories of their lives in a way neither had done with anyone in years. Pauline told him about growing up in Boston, about her father's law practice and her mother's quiet strength, about the books she had read and the education she had received despite the social convention that said women needed nothing more than pretty manners and needlework skills. She told him about meeting Thomas at a lecture on Western expansion, about how his enthusiasm for building something new had swept her along, about the excitement and terror of leaving everything she knew to build a life in the wilderness. Samuel told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his father's violence and his mother's silent endurance, about the farm that never quite prospered, and the dreams that never quite came true. He told her about his brother, 3 years older, and everything his father wanted Samuel to be, strong and confident and untroubled by conscience. He told her about the girl, about how loving her had felt like the first real thing in his life, and about how discovering she loved his brother instead had broken something inside him that he thought could never be fixed. "But you left," Pauline said. "You did not stay and watch them build a life together. That took courage. That was cowardice. I ran away instead of facing the pain. No, staying would have been cowardice. Leaving was brave. You chose to build a new life for yourself rather than let their choices destroy you." Samuel had never thought of it that way before. For 8 years he had carried the shame of running, of being too weak to stay and fight for what he wanted. But maybe Pauline was right. Maybe leaving had been the only way to survive. "I think you are trying to make me feel better about myself," he said. "I think you have spent too long feeling bad about yourself," Paulin countered. "You are a good man, Samuel Jenkins. You just have not let yourself believe it." They camped that night in a shallow canyon, sheltered from the wind that swept across the plains. Paulin shot a rabbit with impressive accuracy, and they roasted it over the fire, the meat tough but edible. After they ate, they sat close together for warmth, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Do you miss Boston?" Samuel asked. "Sometimes. I miss my mother and the library and concerts. But I do not miss the life my father wanted for me. Married to some lawyer or banker, spending my days managing servants and attending tea parties. This life is harder, but it is mine. I built it with my own hands, and nobody can take that away from me. Cartwright is trying." "Cartwright can try all he wants. I am not going anywhere." Paulin looked up at the stars. "Thomas used to say that the West was where people came to reinvent themselves, to be someone new. He was right. Out here, it does not matter who your father is or what family you come from. All that matters is what you do, who you choose to be. Who have you chosen to be? Someone who does not give up. Someone who fights for what is right, even when it is hard. Someone who believes that building something good is worth the struggle." She turned to look at him. "Who have you chosen to be?" Samuel thought about that. For 8 years he had chosen to be alone, to be untouchable, to be the man who never stayed long enough to care. But sitting here with Paulin, feeling the warmth of her beside him and the steady beat of hope in his chest, he realized that choice no longer felt right. "I am still figuring that out," he said honestly. "But I think maybe I am choosing to be someone who stops running." Paulin smiled, and in that moment, something changed in Samuel's heart. It was not the dramatic shift he had expected, not some great revelation or overwhelming emotion. It was quieter than that, gentler, like watching the sun rise and suddenly realizing the darkness had ended without him noticing exactly when. The suffering he had carried for so long, the pain and bitterness and fear that had defined him, seemed to ease in the warmth of that smile. He leaned toward her, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, and kissed her. Paulin kissed him back, her hand coming up to cup his face, and Samuel felt something inside him unlock, some door he had kept bolted shut suddenly swinging open. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, this feeling of vulnerability, of caring so much that it could destroy him if he lost it. When they finally pulled apart, Paulin was smiling again, and Samuel realized he was smiling too, something he did not do nearly enough. "That was unexpected," she said softly, "but not unwelcome, definitely not unwelcome." They held each other as the night grew colder, sharing warmth and quiet conversation until sleep claimed them both. Samuel slept better than he had in years, dreamless and peaceful, with Paulin curled against his chest and the stars wheeling overhead. They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne late the following afternoon, the town sprawling across the plains in a grid of streets and buildings that seemed impossibly organized after the wilderness they had left behind. Cheyenne was a railroad town, grown large on commerce and cattle, bustling with people and wagons and the constant noise of construction. Samuel and Paulin made their way to the territorial courthouse, a 2-story brick building that looked almost elegant compared to the rough wooden structures surrounding it. They hitched the mare outside and climbed the steps, both suddenly nervous about what lay ahead. The clerk's office was on the 2nd floor, a small room crowded with filing cabinets and stacks of legal documents. A young man with ink-stained fingers looked up as they entered, his expression professional but not unkind. "Help you folks. We need to file a land deed with Judge Morrison before the hearing tomorrow," Paulin said, producing the oilskin pouch. The case is Foster versus Cartwright regarding water rights in Silverton. The clerk's eyebrows rose. You are Paulin Foster. We heard you were not going to make it, that Cartwright's men would stop you. They tried, Samuel said grimly. They did not succeed. The clerk took the deed and examined it carefully, checking the seals and signatures. This looks legitimate. I will get it to Judge Morrison tonight. Be here tomorrow at 10 o'clock for the hearing. Do you have a lawyer? I represent myself, Paulin said. Mr. Cartwright has 3 lawyers. Then it should be a fair fight. The clerk grinned despite himself. I like your confidence, madam. Judge Morrison is a fair man, and the law is on your side if this deed is legitimate. But be prepared for Cartwright to put up a fight. They left the courthouse and found a boarding house that would rent them 2 rooms for the night. Samuel wanted to stay close in case Cartwright tried something before the hearing, though he suspected even Cartwright would not be brazen enough to cause trouble in town with federal marshals around. After they settled in, they walked to a small restaurant and ate a real meal for the first time in days. Beef stew and fresh bread that tasted like heaven after rabbit and cold coffee. They talked about the hearing, about what Paulin would say and what arguments Cartwright's lawyers might make, but underneath, the practical discussion was an awareness of each other that had not been there before, a connection that went beyond circumstance and necessity. Whatever happens tomorrow, Paulin said over dessert, apple pie that reminded Samuel of his mother's cooking. I want you to know that I am grateful. You risked your life to help me, and you did not have to. You could have left the deed in Silverton and walked away. I could have, Samuel agreed, but then I would never have met you, and I am starting to think that would have been a terrible loss. Just starting to think that, Paulin teased. Well, I am a slow learner. They walked back to the boarding house as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. At the door to Paulin's room, Samuel hesitated, not wanting to presume but not wanting to leave either. Stay, Paulin said softly, answering the question he had not asked. I do not want to be alone tonight. Samuel followed her into the room and closed the door behind them. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies with a tenderness that surprised them both. It was different from the desperate passion Samuel had known in his youth, less about conquest and more about connection. 2 people choosing to be vulnerable together, to trust each other with their scars and their hope. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Paulin's head on Samuel's chest, listening to his heartbeat. I love you, Samuel said, the words coming easier than he had expected. I did not think I would ever say that to anyone again, but I love you. Paulin lifted her head to look at him, her eyes bright in the lamplight. I love you too. I think I started loving you when you showed up half frozen on my doorstep and still tried to apologize for bringing trouble. You are a good man, Samuel Jenkins, whether you believe it or not. I am starting to believe it, Samuel admitted. You make me want to be the kind of man who deserves you. You already are that man. You just needed to see it. They fell asleep in each other's arms, content and hopeful for the first time in longer than either could remember. The hearing the next morning was everything Samuel had expected and more. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 50s with a reputation for fairness and a low tolerance for nonsense. Cartwright arrived with his 3 lawyers and a smug expression that made Samuel want to punch him. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with cold eyes and the kind of confidence that came from always getting his way. The proceedings began with Cartwright's lawyers presenting their case, arguing that the water rights had been established by prior use and that Paulin's claim was invalid because her husband had never officially filed the proper documents. They produced surveys and witness statements, building what seemed like an overwhelming case. Then it was Paulin's turn. She stood before the judge with quiet dignity and presented the original deed, signed by the territorial governor 15 years earlier, and clearly establishing that the land and water rights belonged to Thomas Foster and his heirs. She explained how Cartwright had taken advantage of her husband's death to claim the water rights, how he had harassed and intimidated her, how his men had ambushed Samuel Jenkins to prevent the deed from reaching the court. "You have proof of these claims, Mrs. Foster?" Judge Morrison asked. "I have the word of Samuel Jenkins, who was shot at by Mr. Cartwright's men while carrying this deed. I have the remains of my hay barn, burned by arsonists 2 weeks ago. I have the bullet holes in my barn from when someone shot at my horse. I have lived with this harassment for 2 years, Your Honor, because Mr. Cartwright wants my land and believes a widow woman will be easy to scare off." Judge Morrison looked at Cartwright. "Do you have anything to say to these accusations?" "The woman is lying, Your Honor. I have no idea who attacked Mr. Jenkins, but it was not my men. As for the fire and the rest, she has no proof I was involved. But you do not deny that you want her land. I have made legitimate offers to purchase it, yes, but I have never resorted to violence or intimidation." The judge studied the deed for a long moment, then looked at Cartwright's lawyers. "Gentlemen, this document is clearly legitimate, bearing the official seal of the territorial governor and properly witnessed. The law is unambiguous here. The water rights belong to Mrs. Foster." "But, Your Honor," one of the lawyers protested, "our client has invested significant resources in developing that land, believing the water rights to be his. Then your client made a poor investment based on false assumptions. That does not give him legal claim to property he does not own." Judge Morrison banged his gavel. "I find in favor of Pauline Foster. The water rights are hers, and Mr. Cartwright is ordered to cease and desist any use of or claim to said water. Furthermore, I am directing the federal marshal to investigate the allegations of harassment and arson." "This hearing is concluded." Cartwright's face went dark with rage, but he did not say anything. He simply turned and stalked out of the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling after him. Samuel watched him go, his hand on his gun, half expecting trouble. But Cartwright was smart enough not to try anything in a federal courthouse. Pauline stood frozen for a moment, as if unable to believe it was really over. Then she turned to Samuel with tears streaming down her face and threw her arms around him. "We won. I cannot believe we won." "You won," Samuel corrected, holding her tight. "You fought for what was yours and you won." They left the courthouse and spent the rest of the day making arrangements. Pauline filed additional paperwork to ensure her claim was ironclad, and Samuel spoke with the federal marshal about Cartwright's men and the ambush on the ridge. The marshal promised to investigate, though he warned that proving Cartwright's involvement would be difficult without witnesses willing to testify against him. That evening they sat in the restaurant where they had eaten the night before, celebrating their victory with steak and potatoes and a bottle of wine that cost more than Samuel usually earned in a week. "What happens now?" Samuel asked, though he was afraid of the answer. The job was done, the deed delivered, Pauline's land secured. There was no reason for him to stay, no excuse to keep him from moving on to the next town and the next job. Pauline looked at him over her wine glass, her expression serious. "That depends on what you want. You could take your payment and ride on like you planned, or you could come back to Silverton with me and see if maybe we can build something together. I am just a ranch hand, Pauline. I do not have land or money or anything to offer you. You have yourself, and that is more than enough. I have land that needs working, a ranch that needs building. I have more work than one person can handle. But more than that, I have a heart that wants to keep loving you if you will let it." Samuel felt that tightness in his chest again, that mixture of fear and hope that came with letting himself care. But this time, instead of running from it, he leaned into it, accepting it as the price of something worth having. "I have spent 8 years alone," he said slowly. 8 years believing that love meant suffering, that caring about anything would only bring pain. But when you smile at me, the suffering stops. Everything stops except this feeling that maybe, just maybe, I have been wrong about everything. Maybe love is not about suffering. Maybe it is about finding someone who makes you want to be brave enough to try. Is that a yes? That is a yes. Samuel reached across the table and took her hand. "I am done running, Pauline. If you will have me, I want to stay. I want to build that ranch with you, build a life with you. I want to be the kind of man who deserves your love, and I want to spend every day trying to make you as happy as you make me." Pauline's smile could have lit up the whole territory. "Then let us go home, Samuel Jenkins. Let us go home and start building." They left Cheyenne the next morning on a new horse Samuel bought with his payment from Pauline, riding side by side back to Silverton. The journey that had been desperate and dangerous on the way out was peaceful and full of promise on the way back. They talked about plans for the ranch, about expanding the herd and fixing the barn and maybe building a new room onto the cabin. They talked about the future with an easy confidence that surprised them both. When they arrived back at the homestead, they found that Cartwright's men had not returned, scared off by the judge's ruling and the marshal's investigation. The cabin was untouched, exactly as they had left it. Pauline stood in the doorway, looking around at her home with fresh eyes, seeing it not as the place she had struggled alone, but as the foundation of something new. Samuel moved in that day, his few belongings barely filling a corner of the cabin. They worked together over the following weeks, repairing the damage from Cartwright's harassment, building new fences and expanding the small herd of cattle. It was hard work, dawn to dusk labor that left them exhausted, but it was good work, building something together. As autumn turned to winter, they prepared for their wedding. It was a simple ceremony in the church at Silverton, attended by the few neighbors who had supported Pauline through her troubles and the handful of townspeople who respected what she had accomplished. Samuel wore his best clothes, still the same ones he had been wearing when he delivered the deed, and Pauline wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. The preacher asked if Samuel would love and honor Pauline, for better or worse, in sickness and health, for all their days. Samuel looked at the woman beside him, the woman who had taught him that love did not have to mean suffering, and answered without hesitation, "I will." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed his bride and felt the last of his old pain finally release its grip on his heart. This was what he had been running from all those years, this feeling of belonging, of being fully known and fully loved. He had been afraid it would destroy him, but instead it made him whole. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, making love and making plans, dreaming about the life they would build together. Pauline fell asleep in Samuel's arms, and he lay awake for a while, listening to her breathe, hardly believing his good fortune. Winter came hard that year, with snowstorms that buried the valley and temperatures that made working outside nearly impossible. Samuel and Pauline spent long evenings by the fire, reading from her collection of books, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. Samuel discovered that being snowed in with someone you loved was not confining but cozy, not claustrophobic but intimate. In the spring, they expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. Samuel proved to be handy with carpentry, a skill he had learned from his father before the old man's drinking made him useless for anything but rage. Pauline worked alongside him, her hammer striking true, her measurements precise. By summer, the ranch was thriving. The cattle had survived the winter and new calves dotted the pasture. The garden Paulin planted yielded vegetables in abundance. They hired a drifter to help with the heaviest work, a young man named Tommy who reminded Samuel of himself 8 years earlier, running from something but not quite sure what. Samuel paid him fairly and treated him kindly, and watched the boy slowly settle into himself, finding his footing. That fall, Paulin told Samuel she was pregnant. He had been in the barn when she found him, forking hay into the stalls, and she simply said the words without preamble or nervousness. "We are going to have a baby." Samuel dropped the pitchfork and stared at her, his mind suddenly blank. A baby. He was going to be a father. The thought terrified him, all the ways he could fail, all the mistakes he could make. His own father had been terrible at it, cruel and violent. What if Samuel turned out the same way? What if he hurt his child the way his father had hurt him? Paulin seemed to read his thoughts. She crossed the barn and took his hands. "You are not your father, Samuel. You are kind and patient and good. You will be a wonderful father. You do not know that." "Yes, I do. I see it every day in how you treat the animals, how you treat Tommy, how you treat me. You have so much love to give, Samuel Jenkins. You have just been afraid to give it. But you are not afraid anymore, are you?" Samuel pulled her close, holding her and their unborn child, and felt something shift inside him again. Not the dramatic change of falling in love, but the quieter transformation of accepting it, of allowing himself to believe he could be the kind of man who built things instead of running from them. "No," he said, "I am not afraid anymore." The baby came the following spring, a boy with Paulin's dark hair and Samuel's blue eyes. They named him Thomas, after Paulin's first husband, because she said Thomas had started the ranch and deserved to be remembered. Samuel held his son for the first time and felt a love so fierce it took his breath away. A protective instinct so strong he would have fought an army to keep this child safe. The suffering he had once believed was the inevitable cost of love seemed like a distant memory now, a younger man's mistake. This was what love meant. Not pain but purpose, not loss but gain, not suffering but joy that made suffering worthwhile. As young Thomas grew, so did the ranch. They added more cattle, bought the neighboring property when the owner died, and built a proper barn to replace the old one. Samuel hired more hands, treating them the way he had always wished to be treated, paying fairly and working alongside them. The ranch became known as a good place to work, and they never lacked for help come roundup time. Paulin proved herself as capable a rancher as she had been a homesteader. She managed the finances, negotiated with buyers, and made decisions with the same practical determination that had kept her going after Thomas's death. The men who worked for them learned quickly to respect her judgment, and those who did not were invited to find work elsewhere. 2 years after Thomas was born, Paulin gave Samuel a daughter they named Catherine, after Paulin's mother. Kathy had Samuel's adventurous spirit and Paulin's stubbornness, a combination that kept her parents constantly entertained and occasionally terrified. She learned to ride before she could properly walk, fearless in the saddle even when Samuel's heart was in his throat watching her. The years passed in the way years do when life is good, quickly but full of moments worth remembering. Samuel taught his children to ride and rope and care for the land. Paulin taught them to read and write and think for themselves. Together they built a family that was loud and messy and full of love. So different from the cold silence. Samuel had grown up with that sometimes he could hardly believe it was real. Cartwright never bothered them again. The marshal's investigation had turned up enough evidence of harassment that Cartwright found himself facing federal charges. And while he managed to avoid prison through expensive lawyers and political connections, his reputation was ruined. He sold his ranch and left the territory, and Samuel never learned where he went. He did not care. The man was part of the past, and Samuel was focused on the future. They added 2 more children over the years, another boy and another girl, and the cabin expanded again to hold them all. Samuel built a proper house eventually, a 2-story affair with enough bedrooms for everyone and a parlor where Pauline kept her books. It was not fancy by Boston standards, but it was home, and that was what mattered. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally asleep and the ranch work was done, Samuel and Pauline would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains red and gold. Sometimes they talked, sharing the small details of their days, planning for the future. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, content in each other's presence. "You ever regret staying?" Pauline asked one evening, 20 years after that first desperate ride to Cheyenne. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had kept running?" Samuel thought about that, about the man he had been when he stumbled onto her doorstep, cold and alone and convinced that suffering was the price of caring. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he had known briefly but barely recognized. "No," he said honestly. "I do not regret a single day. You saved my life, Pauline, in more ways than just pulling me out of the cold. You taught me that love does not mean suffering. You taught me that building something is worth the risk of losing it. You taught me that the only thing worse than getting hurt is never letting yourself feel anything at all." "I did not teach you that," Pauline said, squeezing his hand. "You learned it yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do the learning. Then I am grateful for the place and the teacher." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching their children play in the yard, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, watching the life they had built together continue its steady, beautiful rhythm. Samuel thought about the first time he had seen Pauline smile, standing in the courthouse after winning her case, tears streaming down her face. He had fallen in love with her long before that moment, but that smile had been when he finally understood that loving her did not mean suffering. It meant the opposite. It meant the end of suffering, the beginning of something better. "What are you thinking about?" Pauline asked, noticing his expression. "About the first time I saw you smile in the courthouse, about how everything changed in that moment." "Everything changed long before that. Maybe, but that was when I knew it. When I knew I was done running, done being afraid, done pretending I did not need anyone. That smile ended everything that came before and started everything that came after." Pauline leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then I will have to keep smiling, will I not? Please do. I never get tired of it." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Samuel Jenkins counted his blessings. A wife he loved more with each passing year, children who were healthy and happy and loved. A ranch that prospered through hard work and good fortune. A life that had meaning and purpose and joy. He had spent so many years believing that love meant suffering, protecting himself from the very thing that could have saved him. But then Pauline Foster had opened her door to a half-frozen stranger, and everything changed. She had not just saved his life. She had given him a reason to live it. The children came running as the last light faded, Kathy leading the charge with Thomas and the younger ones trailing behind. They crashed into the porch in a tangle of laughter and energy, demanding stories and treats and attention. Samuel scooped up his youngest daughter and settled her on his lap while Pauline gathered the others close. This was his life now. This noise and chaos and overwhelming love. This family that depended on him and trusted him and believed in him. This woman who had looked past his defenses and seen the man he could become. Samuel kissed the top of his daughter's head and met Pauline's eyes over the children's heads. She smiled at him, that same smile that had ended his suffering all those years ago. And Samuel smiled back, grateful beyond words for the day he had stumbled half-frozen onto her doorstep and found his way home. The night deepened and the stars brightened, and the family sat together on the porch of the house Samuel had built, the ranch Paulin had fought for, the life they had created together out of determination and hope and love. It was not perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. Samuel had learned that love did not mean suffering. It meant choosing someone and being chosen in return. It meant building something that mattered and protecting it fiercely. It meant being brave enough to be vulnerable, strong enough to be gentle, and wise enough to know that sometimes the best thing a man could do was stop running and start living. And when Paulin smiled, all the years of pain and loneliness and fear disappeared like morning frost under the rising sun, leaving only the warmth of being fully, completely, impossibly loved. The end came not with drama but with contentment, not with struggle but with peace. Samuel and Paulin grew old together on the ranch they had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren, leaving behind a legacy not of wealth but of love. And when people asked Samuel Jenkins what had changed his life, what had transformed him from a bitter wanderer into a man who built things that lasted, he always gave the same answer. A woman smiled at me, and the suffering ended. It was that simple and that profound. A smile, a choice, a love that proved stronger than fear. That was all it took to change everything, to turn a man who believed love meant suffering into a man who understood that love meant the opposite. Samuel Jenkins died at 72, surrounded by family, his hand in Paulin's, his heart finally at peace. His last thought was not of regret or fear, but of gratitude, deep and abiding gratitude for the woman who had saved him, the life they had built, and the love that had carried him through every challenge. Paulin followed him 6 months later, her children gathering around her bed as she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. Her last words were about Samuel, about how lucky she had been to find a man brave enough to stop running and wise enough to stay. She died with a smile on her face, remembering all the years of joy, all the moments of love, all the ways they had saved each other. The ranch continued on through their children and grandchildren, the Foster Jenkins spread becoming a fixture of the Wyoming Territory and eventually the state. The story of how it began, with a desperate ride to save a widow's land and a cowboy who learned that love did not mean suffering, became family legend, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, but always with the same essential truth at its heart. Love had saved them both. Love had given them purpose and meaning and joy. And every time someone asked what made their marriage so strong, what kept them devoted through all the years and all the challenges, the answer was always the same. Samuel had believed love meant suffering, but suffering ended when she smiled, and he spent the rest of his life making sure she had reasons to keep smiling. That was the secret, if there was a secret. Not grand gestures or perfect moments, but the daily choice to love and be loved, to build something together that was stronger than either could have created alone. Their graves sat on a hill overlooking the ranch, simple markers bearing their names and the dates of their lives. But their real monument was the family they had created, the land they had worked, the love they had shared. That lived on long after they were gone, passed down through generations, a testament to what was possible when two people were brave enough to take a chance on each other. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the mountains in shades of gold and red, visitors to the ranch swore they could still feel it, the echo of that love that had started with a smile and ended only when death parted them, and perhaps not even then. Samuel Jenkins had been right about one thing. Love did cost something. It cost fear and pride and the illusion of safety that came from keeping everyone at arm's length. But what it gave in return, what it offered to those brave enough to accept it, was worth more than anything Samuel had ever imagined. A home, a family, a purpose, a life worth living. And when Paulin smiled, the suffering ended, replaced by a joy so deep and true that it transformed everything it touched, turning a lonely cowboy into a beloved husband and father, turning a widow's struggle into a thriving ranch, turning pain into purpose and fear into love. That was the real Wild West, not the violence and danger that filled dime novels, but the quiet courage of ordinary people building extraordinary lives out of determination and hope. Samuel and Paulin were proof that love could conquer anything, even the deepest wounds and the darkest fears, as long as people were willing to be brave enough to try. Their story ended as all stories do, with death and loss and the passage of time. But it also continued, in the children who carried their legacy, in the land they had worked, in the love that had bound them together through decades of joy and challenge. And somewhere in heaven, if such a place existed, Samuel Jenkins was still holding Paulin Foster's hand, still grateful for the day he stumbled onto her doorstep, still amazed by the life they had built together. The cowboy had believed love meant suffering, but he had been wrong. Love meant the opposite of suffering. It meant coming home,